Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESFR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, this program was initially planned some 3 weeks ago to discuss two related issues: missile proliferation and nuclear proliferation. The first, because of a policy update by the outgone Biden administration to allow and facilitate support for transferring the missile technology control regime's Category 1 items. These include long-range ballistic missile systems, space launch vehicles, and unmanned aerial systems. The second, perhaps more unwitting, but no less destabilizing, is the rupture current US President Donald Trump has created with his allies and partners, many of which are now having internal conversations about developing nuclear weapons capabilities. We'll discuss these issues, but I would also like to avail of this opportunity, given the expertise of my two guests, to discuss the current crisis between India and Pakistan and the increasing likelihood of a military exchange between this dyad. And we'll try and plug this in with the broader scope of this program. But let me introduce my guest. Dr. Debak is Assistant Professor in Peace and Security at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's also an affiliate at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and the Center for International Research at Sciences Po. Actually, the nomenclature in French is too difficult to pronounce, so I've kind of simply translated it. With him is Fabian Hoffmann. Hoffmann is Doctoral Research Fellow at the Oslo Nuclear Project, University of Oslo. He specializes in missile technology, nuclear strategy, and defense policy. His PhD research explores the strategic level effects of conventional long-range strike weapons, analyzing their implications for conventional and nuclear deterrence. So, welcome to both of my guests. Debak, if I may begin with you, because this program, frankly, as you know, when we were planning it, essentially the prompt is two of your articles, one for the Bulletin and the other for the foreign policy, one on with reference to the missile technology proliferation, the other with reference to nuclear proliferation. So as the three of us sit in different parts of the world, in different time zones, talking about a world that is going bonkers. And as I was, jestingly saying before we started the program that your countrymen are about to bomb my country, so I have to find a bomb shelter. So let's begin with a general sense of why these developments are so destabilizing, especially at a time when, because of a number of other reasons, not least the rising trust deficit among world powers, various armed conflicts in different parts of the world, and emerging technologies, especially in the domain of cyber and quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Why should we be worried? And when I say that, frankly, Debak, I would need more than a bomb shelter to save myself.
Thank you so much for having me on the show again, Ejaz.
Yeah, it's just great. It was great. I had to. I should have mentioned that you are the guest of the pro. You're the friend of the program.
Thanks. So let me start off with a couple of thoughts on that. I think the reason that we are concerned, especially about missile proliferation, and you brought up the fact that the Biden administration, as it was leaving, watered down the missile technology control regime, which pillar one of which essentially says that we will not transfer entire ballistic missiles or entire space launch vehicles or drones or technology essentially that can be used for the delivery of nuclear weapons. We will not transfer those. Now that was watered down. So now that the Biden administration towards the end, as it was leaving, said, no, now we will transfer these weapon systems, and we will transfer these weapon systems to our partners and allies. Presumably, This is aimed towards the Indo-Pacific. It is aimed towards bolstering the capability of US partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific to be able to target China to some extent. Uh, Now, I think it's a risky move. I think it, to some extent, does some of the things that have being talked about by the current administration, which is it puts the defense of certain territories in East Asia and Southeast Asia in the hands of just those countries, saying now you are responsible. You might buy these ballistic missile systems from us, but then you might have to use them yourselves. This is destabilizing for a few reasons. One of which is, of course, it adds to the dynamic of an arms race, right? Where if you start selling entire ballistic missiles to other countries, then adversaries of those countries might think, well, we too need these ballistic missiles. Where do we get these from, right? So are you then opening up a market for Russia or a China to be able to arm other countries or build up their own ballistic missiles, right? Especially in the case of China. That's one major concern. Another major concern, and something we've talked about in the show before, is this concern of inadvertent escalation, right? So as you start arming countries to the T with ballistic missiles, with long-range ballistic missiles, are you setting yourself up for some amount of inadvertent escalation, which means some form of accidental escalation between countries? And finally, I'll just say that there is scholarship now which says that acquisition of ballistic missiles might have a role to play in countries being more interested in nuclear weapons. So, is it possible that you might have some partners and allies of the United States who are not currently nuclear, who acquire ballistic missiles, who basically acquire the delivery capability of nuclear weapons, who then turn around and say, well, I guess we could have nuclear weapons as well.
Absolutely. The funny irony, and let me take this to Fabian here, who's also a friend of the program, and this is the second time he's appearing on the program. So I'm really grateful. The interesting, funny irony is that by doing this, uh, the United States, wittingly or unwittingly, is frankly creating a distinction between missile proliferation and nuclear proliferation. And thereby, in many ways, just to give an example, strengthening Iran's argument that when it comes to a deal on the nuclear program, our missile technology is outside the scope of that deal, right? And I will come to that. But Fabian, how do you look at the situation and creating this distinction? Because you see, frankly, at the end of the day, and this is something that I would like you to explain to our viewers, because you deal with missile technology, medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles with tactical warheads, even when they are very accurate in terms of counterforce targeting, are not particularly effective. And so, therefore, the temptation to put a strategic warhead on those missiles, especially if you're flying them over longer distances, becomes really great in many situations.
So I think, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me again. It's really great to be back. I think Debak made some really great points here. I think I would add 2 or 3 points. The first one, right? I think this idea, I think it's just a bit more nuance to the debate than just saying, that the United States is arming its allies in the Pacific. I definitely think the United States has an interest, right, to arm up its partners and allies in the region. But, obviously there's also a demand side. So I think, if you look at some of the partners in the region, like Australia, like Japan, like others, right, they have a clear demand for these missile systems. So it's not just the United States shoving those missiles on its allies and partners. It's really that these partners actively try to acquire these weapon systems because they believe, right, this is really important in a Indo-Pacific contingency, right, or Taiwan or another scenario, that we are able to strike the adversary, presumably China, at operational and strategic depth, including its homeland territory, right, including from outside its weapons engagement zone. So I think that's the flip side of it. That's important to keep in mind.
So it's
The
not
other point,
it's not just the supply side; it's also the demand side.
exactly, it's not just the supply side. There's also demand side to it. Although, right, I fully agree with Debak that sure, right, the United States has an interest in arming up its allies in the region. Although, right, and I'm sure we get to that later on, that Trump's strategies have been anything else other than coherent on this and other topics. The other point, when it comes to missile proliferation and nuclear proliferation, I do agree that there is a link. I would say that this link is not as direct as it sometimes seems. I've talked about this issue a bit in the European context, right? We talked a lot about Poland, for example, whether they would like to acquire a nuclear weapon, right? And let's say in a world where Poland actually manufactures a nuclear device, I can tell you that there is no realistic scenario where they could do so within the short or even the medium term. But let's ignore that, right? Let's think they could come up with a nuclear device in a relatively short period of time. Where could they integrate this nuclear device? The only missile systems they have are those that are imported from South Korea and from the United States. Now, exactly because to prevent proliferation of missile systems, right, and as an export control measure, if you, as like the non-manufacturer, if you open up this missile, you basically destroy it, right? This is a protective measure that is done by missile manufacturers, that if you open up the missile system, you basically render it unserviceable. Now, of course, you can still open up the missile system. You can look at it. You can look at all the parts, right? So there's a real threat, I think, of reverse engineering. But simply,
you can't retrofit it with a nuclear
no, exactly. I can't. Let's pick a Chasm Yar, right? I can't just open up the Chasm Yar, take out the conventional warhead, put in the nuclear warhead, close it up again. Right. The reason is it's not just that you have to put it back together like a puzzle piece. It's also that probably the warhead will have slightly different dimensions. Its weight balancing will be slightly off. You have to integrate a fuse system, right? So that fuse system needs to communicate with the board computer. So essentially, you can't do that without the manufacturer itself.
You're basically changing the nature of the warhead bus, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
right, the link is not as direct as it is sometimes made to appear. I do agree that there is a link.
So you basically, if I have understood correctly, just a clarification.
Yeah.
That exporting complete missiles is less of a proliferation risk in terms of a mating with nuclear weapons than if these countries were developing their missiles themselves. Have I got that right?
No, not entirely. I would say, right, the proliferation risk comes from the fact that if these missile systems are acquired, right, let's say by Australia, let's say by Japan, by others, sure, they can open up those missile systems and they can learn a hell of a lot of it. But I think if they want to use a missile system for nuclear proliferation, I can't see a scenario where they could actually make an American missile work for that. I think they would have to come up with
that point. I got that point. So what I'm saying is that exporting a complete missile system is less of a hazard than if they were to get the components from left, right, and center and assemble it with a nuclear warhead.
Yes, I also understood that. Yeah, I agree with you on that. It's just I try to make the link, right, that the one thing is facilitated by the other, but there is no direct link between the two.
Okay. So, Debak, so we talked about the missile side of it. But your foreign policy piece talked about, and that is not really a policy decision per se by the Trump administration, so more unwittingly, perhaps, as I said in my introduction also, that through this transatlantic rupture, and also by pushing the allies, back and, actually sort of pushing them right into a corner, there is this possibility that the allies would begin to distrust the United States and the extended deterrence by the United States, and given the various challenges, geopolitical challenges, would likely begin to think like France did after the Suez crisis, to actually develop their own nuclear capabilities. And there are countries like South Korea, like Japan, even Germany, perhaps, where a conversation is going on, and who also have the technological plinth, if you will, from where they can develop nuclear weapons capability. So you think that there is a serious proliferation concern there?
Yes, thanks, Ejaz. And thank you for plugging the piece. Yes, I think there is a serious proliferation concern there. I think that you have a set of countries, both in Europe and in East Asia, who are increasingly feeling more insecure about the fact that they might not have an extended deterrence safeguard, which it's extremely debatable to what extent extended deterrence worked, right? So let's start with that,
That's
right?
that's the famous Charles de Gaulle question to Nixon. Are you
Exactly.
going? Yeah, yeah.
Will you swap New York for
Yes,
Paris, right?
Paris,
So
correct.
let's put those question marks in a box next to this
Yeah,
conversation so that it's visible,
yeah.
and we might go to it at some point. But given what, be that as it may, even with the potential abandonment of whatever commitments that the United States might have had towards these countries, and we're thinking countries like Poland who've said, maybe we need to get our own nuclear weapons, right? Or we're thinking of countries like South Korea who have consistently, over the last few years, polled at over 70% support for nuclear weapons. The even the lack of commitment towards their defense might make them think, well, is this the right time for us to either develop our own weapons or look for some sort of extended deterrence from some other partner, right? So in this context, of course, France has come up, or the UK plus France, some sort of combination where other European nuclear powers provide some form of umbrella. Now, I personally am not sure that would work. I personally am not sure that the forces of those countries are fit for purpose. And I'm also not sure that they can do the work that they're expected to do, right? If it is for France to deter Russia, I don't think that the French can deter Russia from, if they do come in and take Ukraine, to take a slice of Polish land. I don't think that there will be credible commitments from France to swap Paris for Warsaw.
Precisely. And frankly, during the Cold War, the British and the French nuclear arsenals were not really, as far as the Soviets were concerned, those arsenals were not really a matter of concern to begin with. The entire thing was between the United States and the USSR. But here, I want to get into another issue also, which kind of links up with this current India-Pakistan standoff, if you will. So countries, and this is an important question, not just with reference to the India-Pakistan dyad, but also more broadly. And I would like to get Fabian's take on this also. This whole idea of having nuclear weapons as a deterrent, which will somehow completely prevent, if you will, another nuclear power from attacking you, seems to not really bear fruit, in the sense that since the Twin Peaks crisis, India has actually tried to develop a doctrine of limited war below the nuclear overhang. You might recall that General V.P. Malik's vice chief, actually read a paper in Delhi which talked about it. Then the whole idea of cold start, which was later renamed proactive operations, and the whole IBGs, and the whole idea of punishing Pakistan in a narrow band. So what I'm basically trying to say is that there are the higher order attacks, and then there are the lower order attacks. And what we have seen in 2016 or 2019, that India has tried to change the dynamic, or what they call the new normal, by forcing uh, conventional conflicts at particular points, not an overall war, but drawing blood, which obviously, and we can come to that later, but first I want to get your take on the broader issue, which obviously have an escalatory potential. But my basic question to you at this point, and then we'll get into what's happening right now, is it a panacea, as in like a defensive panacea, or are we now getting into a situation with non-nuclear strategic weapons and artificial intelligence and a number of other emerging technologies that might just, paradoxically enough, bring down the defensive salience or deterrent salience of the nuclear weapons, and at the same time enhance the escalation potential of any conflict?
Right. So I will say that I think you're right, Ejaz, and I think that European strategic thought on this recently has been extremely reminiscent of the Cold War dynamic. It almost seems like it's not updated its priors with what's been happening in the rest of the world, right?
Correct.
So the idea that, oh, if we get nuclear weapons, we can deter, right? And the question is, deter what?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's where we need to think about the fact that you've got other nuclear countries like India and Pakistan who have fought wars. Let's remember the Kargil War, for example, right?
Although, sorry, I'm getting. Although at that point, nuclear forces were not really in any shape or form on either side. But yes, I take your point.
Well, to be fair, both sides had a nuclear program before 1998. So if it came to that, you could have had some form of early capability to deliver. There's no doubt about that. But either way, be that as it may, even with subconventional attacks on India, or say Balakot, when India went and attacked Pakistan in response to the Pulwama incident, all of these tell us that conventional escalation, subconventional escalation and attacks from a nuclear country towards another nuclear country is entirely possible, with both sides having a mature nuclear program. So at that point, to answer your question, Ejaz, nuclear weapons are not a silver bullet, right? So
Yeah,
you might have
absolutely.
nuclear weapons, and you might still have conventional escalation.
Absolutely. But so Fabian, the original thrust of my question to Debak, but I just also want to add another point with reference to the fact that the escalation potential of these skirmishes is obviously there, because once that happens, it's like a stone in free fall. Neither side can really control this. Also, the fact that the Cold War stability paradox, where the center held and the periphery was destabilized. The issue is, neither for Europe, there is no real periphery for Europe, and there's no real periphery for either India or Pakistan. And there's not going to be a real periphery for South Korea and North Korea, or Japan and North Korea, or Japan and China. So the issue is, from where I stand, is like, we're really on a slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, right, as Debak said, I mean, nuclear weapons, I think they're really good at deterring some kinds of threats, and that's existential threats to the survival of the state as such, right? And this is, for example, if you look at the European context, this is what this was or still is the purpose, really the primary purpose of the French and the British arsenals. And I think for that purpose, they're absolutely fit, right? They have done a good job doctrinally in terms of force posture. The United States, the United Kingdom and France, they're absolutely able to deter these existential threats against their homeland territories. And now I agree with Debak, right? This becomes really problematic if you then think about extending deterrence. If you think about more of these limited war scenarios, right? Deterring sub-existential threats. And this is where your large strategic nuclear arsenals, or not even large ones, right? Just let's say in a short retaliatory capability, somewhat falls short. I mean, in the end, we don't fully know, but we don't want to trust that it does, right? And that's why we take those extra steps to make sure that it does. So that's especially the United States during the Cold War and after adapted its posture in such a way that it could credibly reassure European allies that the United States would be able to fight and win a nuclear war at every level, first against the Soviet Union and later against Russia. And this is something that France and United Kingdom at present simply cannot offer their allies. And I think this is where those potential deterrence gaps come in and where it is quite dangerous, right? And then I agree with you.
Fabian, sorry. Yeah. I mean, when you say that the British and French deterrent doctrinally did their job very well. Yeah. I mean, they did their job. Basically, at best, they were second-tier umbrellas. I mean, they also had the broader U.S. umbrella.
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't even call them umbrellas. I really think
it reminds me of that. It reminds me of that great episode from Yes, Prime Minister, a program that I absolutely love, where Jim Hacker is asked, deter against whom? You've got 12 hours. And then, of course, the fact that what do you deter? The Russians, the East German police standing on the West German side of Brandenburg Gate? Would you deter? Let's assume the Russians march in. Would you use the nuclear weapons? So the question of who to deter and at what point to deter,
I think I answered that already. I think I answered it already. It is the existential threat, right, to the survival of the nation as such, and this is something that these arsenals absolutely do deter. There is no doubt about that. I mean, sorry, let me finish. Please let me finish. Okay. Let me make my point, and then you can jump in, okay? But the thing is, so if Russia were to launch a large-scale nuclear attack against British and French population centers, there is no doubt in my mind, right, that France and the United Kingdom would shoot back. And this is something that fundamentally affects decision-making calculus in Moscow, right? So in that sense, I think they serve as very effective. They have and they continue to serve as very effective national deterrents. I do not believe that at present they can serve a very effective umbrella purpose, right? Extending deterrence. I don't think they're fit for purpose when it comes to that.
Okay, let's take your point. I want to take this to Debak. So to me, it now appears that the large geographical size of Russia in this case would be a great advantage in an existential crisis on both sides, right? Yep. And if the Russians were to decide that they are going to just get the British and the French up in a mushroom cloud, even if they were to respond, a large part of Russia and a large part of the Russian population would still be there, while France and the United Kingdom would be up in the mushroom cloud.
Really quickly, that's factually somewhat incorrect, because the population density of Russian cities is quite a lot higher than that of France and the United Kingdom, right? You have St. Petersburg and Moscow, as well as the suburbs of those cities. So in that sense, you could make the counter argument that actually Russia is quite a lot more vulnerable to a nuclear war than France and the United Kingdom, though I would say they're both. I mean, in the end, the existence of the nation would be ended as a result of a large-scale war.
Okay. So we're basically talking about a doomsday scenario, right?
Yeah. If it comes to large-scale strategic attack.
And we are hoping that this idea would deter both sides, where we are thrown back to the very basics of deterrence. But here's the thing, Debak. If we were to actually stick to the very basics of deterrence, that there is a balance of terror and both sides can punish each other, and therefore neither will do something silly. So it's basically like Achilles' lance. But then we have also decided on all sides to develop his shield. And one side thinks that it has got the lance also, it's got the shield also. The other side only has the lance. So therefore, we have more room for maneuver. And that is obviously unstable. And that is also, given the possibilities of preemption and the rest of it. So we seem to be going round in circles when you talk about nuclear strategy, which frankly, Philip Windsor said, when you talk about nuclear weapons, there is no strategy. And Lawrence Friedman said, there was the Kanyan school, there was a, Schelling school, but at the end of the day, if we are still alive, that's only because of luck, not because of any of these strategies.
Yeah, I agree. Look, in some ways, let's be very clear. There is no such thing as a winnable nuclear war.
Yeah.
Right. So if we can agree on that, then we've got to think about what do our nuclear warfighting strategies then really give us, right? What Fabian was talking about earlier in terms of population densities is this idea that the British had during the Cold War, for example, right, which was the Moscow criteria, which essentially said we don't need to target the rest of the Soviet Union as long as we can take out Moscow. That would be enough. The idea here was that the British would be able to hold Moscow hostage, right? So deterrence is essentially the idea that you can hold a city or a certain population hostage. So Elaine Scarry has a great article in the Boston Review about deterrence as a hostage-taking mechanism. But the idea here is also deterrence by punishment, is saying that if you do X, then we will go and hit you. Now, there is also a question here, which was discussed during the Cold War, which is that if the Soviet Union did, in fact, hit the UK with an overwhelming nuclear strike, with the UK's nuclear weapons being out at sea, if the UK was truly destroyed, what would be the point of actually going back to hit Moscow? What utility would that Moscow criterion really have if you have nothing left to defend?
Precisely.
Right. So you are right. And just bringing back to the point of luck that you just brought up, there are several scholars now who have written extensively on this idea that, there have been far too many close calls with the control of nuclear weapons, with the management of nuclear weapons, where people assume that they can control fully and ensure that there's 100% safety record, which we know is just not true. Right. We know that there have been command and control issues. We know that there have been nuclear accidents in the past in Europe, where the B-52 bombers have fallen apart over Spain, with thermonuclear bombs falling in Europe, or in North Carolina, where there were two new thermonuclear bombs which fell in the early 1960s. Even the 1980s, with the Soviets thinking that there was an imminent strike coming into the Soviet Union from the United States. So a world where we are completely safe in this idea that we have some form of deterrence is one that's not necessarily that safe, as it turns out, if you look at the empirical record that we have.
Absolutely. I had Jeffrey Knopf on the program. This was some months ago. And we had this fantastic discussion. And one of the points that he was talking about, which I thought was very, very incisive, was to kind of collapse the idea of risk and uncertainty, because risk is something like, an insurance agency would look at the risk, calculate the risk, and, have that, what we call the risk premium. But uncertainty is a completely different, kettle altogether. And so, therefore, at the end of the day, there are so many imponderables that it's extremely difficult to figure out where it will go. I mean, just going back to India's idea of limited, war scenario, one of the assumptions, in fact, two assumptions, I would say, or one flowing from the other, that we can A, control escalation, and B, we can dominate it. And to me, that's a very unstable proposition, because it is, for instance, it's true in 2019, it got upended. And so, therefore, for any one of the dyad, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan, to think that they can control and dominate escalation, in other words, to say to have planned escalation, that takes me back to Mike Tyson's idea of, everyone has got a plan until he gets punched in the face. So, you can't really plan escalation or even plan anything, whether it's conventional or whether it's nuclear.
Yeah, Fabian, you want to take that?
It's for both of you. So, Fabian.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think Debak, you made some really great points there. I think, I would add that in that kind of deterrence world that we live in, right, uncertainty and, the risk that something could get out of hand. I mean, that's not an accident. That's kind of by design. And, a lot of nuclear postures are postured in that way to really signal to the adversary that, once the escalation process gets going, we might not be able to control it. I mean, that's been, the whole purpose.
That's the whole shelling idea, frankly.
Exactly, like the manipulation of risk. That's the whole idea also of forward deployed nuclear weapons, those that are still in Europe. I mean, the idea is not, that you would fight an effective nuclear war with those. The idea is that if certain thresholds have been crossed, we might want to employ, one or a couple of those nuclear weapons to signal to Russia that, look, until here and not a step further, because otherwise the consequences, they might be completely disproportionate to whatever objectives you are trying to achieve.
Okay.
Right, and just harping on our shelling theme here. Manipulation of risk is also two people in a boat with one person rocking it, right? As Schelling writes about. So you might both fall into the water. So a posture which says that yes, I will compel you to do certain things, but I'm fine with my arm being cut off in the process is, I'm not sure, for a population or any democratic civilian population, is a terribly good posture to begin with. And on that, I'll come to the India-Pakistan point that Ejaz you made, which is, is escalation controllable? I think it's a very slippery slope, right? At the same time, I think there is a concern in India increasingly that is there a way to respond to subconventional attacks that are seen to be backed by Pakistan? And I think India is really trying to open up the set of levers that it might have to be able to do what you would call deterrence by punishment in the nuclear world, right? So in some ways, the abeyance of the Indus Water Treaty that just happened as a response to the terror attack in Pahalgam is India opening up a toolkit which is not just a military toolkit, right? Now, how that will progress is your guess is as good as mine. But it's trying to expand that set of things.
My point really was that yes, what I call a target bank, both for non-kinetic and for kinetic options.
Right.
And so the target bank essentially for non-kinetic options is what are the possible levers, where are the pain points, and it's essentially diplomacy and so on and so forth.
Right.
But my issue here really was the entire talk about a kinetic response. And so my thrust was the kinetic response. And we can debate the issue of a number of such attacks, about which a number of questions have been raised by investigative journalists and analysts within India, in terms of how those attacks could actually have been prevented, and why were they not prevented. So there are a number of questions which obviously are outside the scope of our program. But the thing is that it is a slippery slope. But anyway, before I close the program, I want to ask both of you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you, given the geopolitical situation, given emerging technologies, given increasing distrust among the nations, of the possibility of us going up in smoke?
Yeah, I mean, right. I, I see the allure of trying to quantify this. I'm not sure, Debak, if you want to do that. I'm not sure if I'm very comfortable giving a precise number. I will say two things. First, I'm less worried about emerging technologies or technologies overall, because in the end, right, statesmen, those are the ones that decide to go to war or not technologies. I will also say, right, that while I really believe that we have to try.
But they employ, but Fabian, they employ
Yes.
technologies, right?
Yeah, they do,
When they
right? But
decide to go to war.
I think the most likely scenario, for example, in Europe, where I see a war emerging between Russia and NATO, is because Russia takes a deliberate escalatory step, right? Initiates a warfighting scenario. I think, while I do agree, right, that the chances of an unintended or accidental escalation, they're not zero. I think the likelihood of a deliberate escalatory scenario, they're much more likely. So this is the one that I'm concerned about. And then I will say, right, with the United States stepping back from its security commitments from Europe, with Russia appearing incredibly aggressive, clearly an imperialist power hungry nation that certainly will not stop in Ukraine if it is not stopped in Ukraine. I do believe that the likelihood of a major interstate war in Europe has risen dramatically compared to previous years. So I think there is major reason to be concerned. I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't want to give a precise number, right? But I
No, no,
am worried.
I didn't really want a precise
Yeah, yeah.
number in the sense of
No,
a number.
exactly. But
But
I
anyway,
am worried, right? And I
before
think many of my colleagues would agree that this is a less than fortunate situation that we find ourselves in.
no, but before I force Debak into providing this number, which obviously all of us are not particularly comfortable with. You see, the reason we talking about the nuclear weapons and missilery and emerging technologies, Fabian, is that if you look at the Russo-Ukraine war, and if you substitute the Russian president with Stalin, and if you substitute Ukraine with Finland, and go back to the 1939 Winter War, obviously there are differences, but there are a number of similarities of how the Russians got bogged down, and how blah blah blah, and how ultimately the Finns had to concede, and so on. So my point is that because it was the pre-atomic bomb world, no one had the kind of concern that we're talking about at this stage. So that is where technologies come in, and therefore my question of how worried we should be. Debak, your number.
Thank you. I'm going to take Fabian's lead here and not actually give you a number. I will say I'm extremely worried, right? But for, I think, different reasons than have been discussed earlier. I think that the Russia's war in Ukraine expanding to Europe is is one that I find terribly confusing because, you've got two Russias that people talk about. One is the Russia that's going to sort of overrun Western Europe, for which Europe needs nuclear weapons to be able to deter Russia, right? And then you've got the other Russia that can't move their tanks through the mud in Ukraine, right?
Thank you. If you were sitting next to me, I would have offered you a cup of tea for saying the obvious.
Well, no, then I want to Debak, you're free to finish, but then I give the answer to that. Okay?
Absolutely. Let me finish that. I think that there is, given these two Russias that people talk about, depending on where whatever position that they're sort of pushing forward on, I think that which Russia will we see? Does Russia have the conventional power to go through NATO? If the Ukraine war is an example of what their conventional power is, then one has reason to be skeptical. What I am more worried about, though, is this idea of diffusion of different types of technology all along the escalation ladder, which is taking place across the Indo-Pacific, especially with missile arsenals. I am concerned, even more so than usual, and this has come across in your comments as well, Ejaz, about the potential for an India-Pakistan escalation. I think that, perhaps last week we wouldn't be thinking about subconventional escalation leading to some sort of a major war. But this week we are definitely thinking about it, and it's weighing on everybody's minds. So those are the sort of things that I think make me extremely worried, especially when these interactions are happening between nuclear countries and nuclear adjacent countries. So extremely worried is the box that I would put in, and you can think of that as anywhere between the 5 and 10.
Yeah. And talking of contiguity, we talked about the India-Pakistan dyad. There is the India-China dyad, and if you bring in China, India, and Pakistan, you've got a contiguous nuclear triad.
No, absolutely. And you think about China responding to the United States, and so let's bring in the US as well, right?
Absolutely.
So you do have a strategic pain.
But Fabian wanted to respond to your two Russia explainer. Go ahead, Fabian.
Yeah, I think the mistake here is to assume, right, that a war in Ukraine and a war in Ukraine would look similar to a war between NATO and Russia, or that Russia is planning for a similar type of war. If you look at Russian strategy documents and Russian doctrine, actually already in the pre-war years, even though Putin loves to say that he is fundamentally superior to the West and Europe, Russian decision makers, Russian analysts, they knew, or they still know, that on an economic, industrial, financial level, Russia is fundamentally inferior to Europe, at least in the medium to long term, right? So Russian decision makers are fully aware that in an attritional warfighting scenario, they would always lose. So what have they been planning for, or what are they planning for when it comes to Europe? It is a short, quick, decisive engagement, right? One where they would rapidly escalate, both with long-range strikes against strategic level targets inside Europe, immediately raise the prospect of nuclear escalation. And here's the thing, not defeat the European armies in the field, because again, they know they can't do that, but bet on the fact that European decision makers would lack resolve, give in, and settle the conflict on Russian terms. And the last point I will make is, right, I'm not too concerned that Russia would actually get away with it, but I'm very concerned that Russia might miscalculate, because we have seen Russia in the past, when it comes to Ukraine, incredibly miscalculate its odds and take decisions that in the end kind of backfired on several levels, although of course we still have to see the ultimate outcome of the war. So I do believe you can reconcile those two Russias, right? A Russia can exist that fundamentally struggles in an attritional war in Ukraine, but it can also be in Russia that still presents a very credible and direct threat to European NATO states.
Well, Fabian has given me a prompt for another full episode with reference to two Russias. But Fabian, as a minor student of military strategy, I believe, historically speaking, invariably it's some kind of miscalculation that leads states into war. I mean, that famous 95 article by Farron about, realist assumptions of why, if wars are costly, why can't you have an ex ante negotiation rather than a post fact cost? But it's there. But thank you so much to both of you, Fabian, especially to you since you're also traveling. Debak, pleasure as always, and let's hope that I don't have to go to a bomb shelter after this. And
Let's hope nobody has to go to a bomb shelter.
let's hope
Yes.
nobody has to go to a bomb shelter.
Yeah.
And this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, do subscribe to the channel. The subscriptions don't get me Luca, but they would help us get notification when a new episode drops. And also, we get good guests. Until next time, take care and goodbye.